Welcome back to some more Doctor Who trivia. We're now going to be diving into the 10th Doctor era from 2005 to 2010. We've got quite a lot to get through, so without further ado, let's begin. The Christmas Invasion. The Guinevere 1 probe was inspired by the Beagle 2, a British-made spacecraft which landed on the surface of Mars on Christmas Day 2003. Sadly, the malfunction of its solar panels prevented the Beagle 2 from establishing contact with its operators on Earth, and the mission was deemed a failure. Russell T Davies also remembered the first pictures sent from Mars by the Viking 1 lander in July 1976, and he wanted the Guinevere 1 to transmit something more exciting than the empty, bleak Martian landscape. This suggested the monstrous Sycorax, who were named after the mother of the grotesque Caliban in William Shakespeare's fantasy The Tempest. New Earth. The sequences outside the TARDIS on New Earth were filmed on September the 26th at Wormshead in Rossley on the Gower Peninsula. Unfortunately, the shoot was hampered by driving wind and rain, and insufficient daylight forced the abandonment of the last scene to be recorded, intended to bridge the final hospital sequence and the material at Cassandra's party. Tooth and Claw. A historical in-joke can be found in the names Maxon and Ramsay, given to the soldiers who fetched the Koh-i-Noor diamond from Queen Victoria's carriage. These were the surnames of the men who actually transported the diamond from the Indian subcontinent. School Reunion. The new K9 prop debuted on August 24th, having been constructed by Mike Tucker's model unit team with reference to an authentic 70s K9 prop he owned. Unfortunately, the robot dog's tradition of struggling with movements over various surfaces continued into the 21st century. The tiled kitchen floor posed a particular challenge. Furthermore, during the climactic kitchen sequence, K9's eyepiece was made to flash in time with his dialogue. This was out of keeping with the manner in which the robot dog had been portrayed in the classic series, and when Phil Collinson, producer, learned of it upon his return from a holiday, he indicated that the practice should be abandoned for the remainder of K9's scenes. The Girl in the Fireplace. The rotating fireplace was suggested by an anecdote in the Madame de Pompadour 1954 biography by Nancy Mitford, who related the discovery by one of Louis XV's courtiers, the tax collector Alexandre Lariche de la Pompadour, that his wife was employing such a device to facilitate an extramarital affair. In a Doctor Who context, Stephen Moffat thought the fireplace could work like the back door in the 1958 Philippa Pierce novel Tom's Midnight Garden, through which a modern-day boy encountered a Victorian girl at various stages of her life. He also drew upon elements of his space library idea, which would have been connected via window-like portals to all the libraries of the past. Another inspiration was the non-linear romance at the heart of Audrey Niffenegger's 2003 novel The Time Traveller's Wife. Ironically, Moffat would subsequently script its 2022 television adaptation. Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel. As John Lumick, director Graham Harper cast Roger Lloyd Pack, who was eager to play the villain in the manner of Donald Rumsfeld, the United States Secretary of Defense who was one of the chief architects of the 2003 Iraq War. Shortly before filming began, Lloyd Pack broke his ankle in a fall down a flight of stairs. Fortunately, the John Lumick role had already been scripted as being entirely wheelchair-bound, meaning that Roger Lloyd Pack's injury would not interfere with his performance. The Idiot's Lantern. One of the story's key supporting characters was Tommy Connolly, whom writer Mark Gatiss initially intended to reflect some of his own experiences as a gay teenager. One idea was to tease the notion that Tommy was romantically interested in Rose, only for him to reveal in the closing moments that he was actually attracted to the Doctor. However, Mark Gatiss decided to change tactic after watching the later episodes of Series 1, in which the Doctor and Rose were accompanied by the explicitly and unapologetically bisexual Captain Jack Harkness. Mark Gatiss concluded that this was a more modern and effective way to explore sexual orientation in Doctor Who, and Tommy's role in the narrative was consequently changed. The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit. Writer Matt Jones obtained Russell T Davies's permission to use the Slitheen, first introduced in 2005's Aliens of London and World War III. Now enslaved by humanity, the Slitheen secretly believed that the planet orbiting the black hole was actually the dwelling place of their god, who would free them from servitude. At a late stage, however, Russell T Davies became concerned that the presence of the returning Slitheen was detracting from the humans whose pioneer spirit he felt was at the heart of this story. He discussed the matter with Millennium Effects, who provided many of the practical elements for the series. They confirmed that they could create a small set of simple alien masks within the budget originally allocated to refurbish the Slovene costumes. On this basis, RTD devised a new alien race which he dubbed the Ood. Their simple name was a deliberate contrast to his typical flair for ostentatious alien nomenclature, and reflected his intention that they seemed odd. Their uniform appearance was based upon the aliens of the 1964 serial The Sensorites, which RTD imagined that the two races hailed from sister planets. The Ood were given long facial fronds and a translation device to avoid the need for an expensive mouthpiece or complex animatronics. Love and Monsters. In 2004, RTD developed an unused idea for the Doctor Who magazine comic strip, featuring a protagonist whose life has been touched by major events from the programme's history. RTD now felt that this would be an effective foundation for the Doctor Light episode. Originally, work on this concept proceeded under the title I Love the Doctor, and concerned a female fan of the Doctor who was essentially stalking him. With Series 2 already populated with women in strong supporting roles, however, RTD decided to replace the female stalker with a male protagonist named Elton Pope. He wanted to use Elton and his friends to explore the nurturing environment provided by fandom, but also how this could be spoilt by domineering, self-important superfans. Fear Her. The script, originally intended to be the 11th episode of Series 2, came from the mind of Stephen Fry, and was known by the placeholder title The 1920s. Eventually, however, budget issues prompted the postponement of Stephen Fry's adventure for the following year, and would ultimately be abandoned altogether. Army of Ghosts and Doomsday. One of the season finale's big surprises was effectively spoiled at the BAFTA Awards on May the 7th. The organisers had arranged for the involvement of two Daleks in the proceedings, including one which would burst onto the stage as Russell T Davies, Julie Gardner and Phil Collinson accepted Doctor Who's trophy for Best Drama Series. To the three producers' horror, however, it was not a bronze Dalek which emerged to greet them as expected, but instead the black-livered casing, telegraphing the fact that the Daleks would be returning for the second series. The Runaway Bride. This Christmas special was intended to be the sixth instalment of the 2006 series, positioned after Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel. The narrative involved a mysterious bride, who appeared in the TARDIS to confront the Doctor and Rose Tyler. However, these plans would change in the wake of the BBC's announcement on June 15, 2005, concerning the future of Doctor Who. Not only had the show been renewed for a third series, to transmit in 2007, but also for a second annual Christmas special in 2006. Russell T Davies decided that the holiday episode was a better use of the light-hearted storyline he envisaged for the Runaway Bride, and instead developed Tooth and Claw to replace it in Series 2. Smith and Jones. Freema Agyeman had unsuccessfully auditioned for the role of Sally in 2005's The Christmas Invasion. Despite the decision against casting Agyeman in that episode, she had nonetheless impressed the production team and was cast as Adiola in the 2006 finale. Unbeknownst to Agyeman, this was privately considered a preliminary audition for Martha Jones. Producer Phil Collinson in particular kept a close eye on her performance. Agyeman was then invited to an audition on January 17, 2006, for what she believed to be the role of Gwen Cooper in the upcoming spin-off series Torchwood. In fact, she was reading for Martha Jones. A second audition followed on February 3rd, after a brief delay while Agyeman recovered from an illness. Now nervously aware that she was in the running for a regular role in Doctor Who, Agyeman had a screen test with David Tennant on February 15th. 2 days later, she learnt that she would become Martha Jones. The Shakespeare Code. Mother Bloodtide is played by Linda Clark. I would later work with Linda in the same pantomime company where she works as a director. Though she didn't direct me personally, we did talk behind the scenes about the witch makeup. She told me it took over 4 hours to apply. Gridlock. Several elements of Gridlock were directly inspired by the comic book 2000 AD, an anthology which had been running since 1977. From the Judge Dredd strip, RTD seized upon the overcrowded megacity one for the look of New New York. The dystopian 1982 film Blade Runner was also an inspiration. Dredd's informant Mark Normal suggested the appearance of the bowler-hatted businessman, while reporter Swifty Frisco from the Ballad of Halo Jones gave RTD the idea for Sally Calypso. In contrast, Brannigan's aviator-influenced look was taken directly from Rats, a character created for BBC children's programming in 1994. The element of the mood drugs came from the BBC's booked 2009 Ninth Doctor novel, Only Human. Daleks in Manhattan and Evolution of the Daleks. It was discovered that the hands had not been ordered for Eric Lawrence costume for the Dalek-Sec hybrid. With no time to fabricate replacements, the actor was instead given a pair of black gloves to wear for the sequence in which Diagras was consumed by Dalek-Sec. It was then realised that the panic had all been for nothing. The hands had been made after all, and the gloves were quietly ignored in subsequent scenes. So if you're wondering why Mr. Diagras randomly puts on black gloves when he enters the Dalek lair, that's the reason. The Lazarus Experiment. Stephen Greenhorn hit upon the notion of an aged scientist trying to make himself young again. This character was first given the name Professor Anger and subsequently became Professor Lazarus, after the man raised from the dead by Jesus Christ in the Gospel according to John. Accordingly, the episode gained the working title The Madness of Professor Lazarus. 42. Writer Chris Chibnall decided to call the spaceship at the centre of 42 the SS Icarus, after the Greek myth about a boy who could fly using an invention of his father's, but was perished when he soared too close to the sun. It was discovered that Sunshine, a solar-themed sci-fi film directed by Danny Boyle, due for British release in April, featured a spaceship called the Icarus II. It was agreed that the name of the craft in 42 could be changed through altered graphics, editing and dubbing without much difficulty. As such, the vessel was rechristened the SS Pentalion, after the Pentalion drive mentioned in 1975's Revenge of the Cybermen. Human Nature and the Family of Blood. The sequences inside the family spaceship was actually a redressed version of a portion of the hub, the HQ used by Captain Jack Harkness and his team in the spin-off series Torchwood. Blink. Stephen Moffat decided to base his script upon a short story he had written for the Doctor Who Annual 2006, released by Panini Publishing in August 2005. Entitled What I Did on My Christmas Holidays by Sally Sparrow, it concerned a 12-year-old girl who discovered messages addressed to her hidden behind wallpaper, in old photographs and on videotapes. They had all been left by the Ninth Doctor, who was stranded in 1985. The TARDIS had jumped 20 years into the future, and he needed Sally to pilot the time machine back to him. Since this narrative already marginalised the Doctor's presence, Stephen Moffat began work on an expanded version for the programme's intended Dr. Light episode. Utopia, The Sound of Drums, and Last of the Time Lords. Leo Jones was intended to appear in Last of the Time Lords, welcoming Martha back to Britain and introducing her to Tom Milligan. This had to be changed due to Reggie Yates' limited availability, as a result of which he could spare only one recording day for Doctor Who. Instead, Reggie Yates' involvement was restricted to a short segment of The Sound of Drums. Dialogue now referred to Leo working in the Master's slave force under an assumed name, although it was dropped from the final edit. Voyage of the Damned. Abandoned at an early stage were plans to include the Jadoon at the adventure's ending. Sadly, this was changed. It would have been nice to see the Big Chief Rhino boys again for Christmas. Partners in Crime. Russell T Davies had intended to pair the Doctor with a companion in their mid-30s called Penny Carter, who was based in part on Donna Noble. During March 2007, however, it was learned that Catherine Tate herself was interested in returning to Doctor Who, and a deal was rapidly put together for her to co-star as Donna in all 13 episodes of Series 4. The Fires of Pompeii. One of the Sisterhood members is played by Karen Gillan, and Kay Killis is played by Peter Capaldi. I only hope their careers flourished after this episode, because they're good actors. Planet of the Ood. In addition to the Ood, writer Keith Temple planned to revisit another character from The Impossible Planet. This was scientist Ida Scott, played by Claire Rushbrook, who had formed a close bond with the Doctor. She would now be a member of an investigative team looking into conditions on the Ood sphere, and would be dismayed to discover that her estranged father had become involved with Ood operations. They would later be reconciled when it was revealed that he was secretly acting on behalf of the Ood. In the end, however, it was agreed that writer Keith Temple should develop entirely new characters for Planet of the Ood. The Sontaran Stratagem and the Poison Sky. A long issue, which RTD decided to confront in this two-parter, was UNIT's name. Following its mention in Aliens of London, the BBC was made aware that the real United Nations was now concerned about being associated with a fictional entity, and was especially wary of any confusion which might arise from people encountering online references to UNIT. RTD's initial reaction was simply to avoid any explanation of the unit acronym, but this approach was no longer viable. It was finally agreed that the organisation would now be identified as the Unified Intelligence Task Force. The Doctor's Daughter. The role of Jenny went to Georgia Moffat, who, ironically, really was the Doctor's daughter. Her father was Peter Moffat, under his professional name of Peter Davison, who had played the Fifth Doctor in the 1980s. Georgia Moffat would later marry David Tennant, being the Doctor's daughter and wife. The Unicorn and the Wasp. In December 1926, in the midst of a profoundly unhappy period, Agatha Christie had disappeared without explanation for 11 days. Her mother had passed away earlier that year, and Agatha Christie had newly learned that her husband was having an affair. She vanished from their home in Sunningdale, Berkshire, and her car was found abandoned at Newlands Corner in Surrey, near a pond called the Silent Pool. She eventually surfaced at a hotel in Harrogate, Yorkshire, where it appeared that she was suffering from amnesia, possibly brought about by a nervous breakdown. At the time, however, the popular opinion was that Christie had merely staged a publicity stunt to help boost book sales. This disappearance became the basis for the episode. Silence in the Library and Forest of the Dead. Stephen Moffat imagined that the Dr. Moon might be so called because the Doctor himself would one day be uploaded there as a data ghost, following his eventual demise. I personally do support this theory. Dr. Moon is an AI version of the Doctor. No ifs, ands or buts here. Midnight. This episode would be the first story since 1975's Genesis of the Daleks in which the TARDIS made no on-screen appearance. It only took 33 years. Turn left. RTD considered exploring how stories set in the past or on other planets would be affected by the Doctor's demise. For instance, he thought that the Unified Intelligence Task Force might send Time Warriors to the year 1599 to foil the plot of the Carrionites, whom the Doctor had defeated in the Shakespeare Code. Ultimately, however, this would bog down the episode a lot, and was particularly undesirable in a story which might be hostile to casual audience members. The Stolen Earth and Journey's End. The appearance of various returning aliens had been considered during the scene at the Shadow Proclamation, a list which had grown to include the Sycorax, the Hath, Vesper forms, and even a giant adult adipose, and was substantially cut, with only the Jadoon being retained. RTD had included a cameo role for Annette Badland, whose Slovene character had reverted to a baby at the conclusion of Boomtown, and she would now be in the care of Jingathene, another family from Raxacoricophalopatorius, but would react badly to the presence of the Doctor. Badland had already recorded accompanying dialogue, but unfortunately it would go unused. RTD also excised a lengthy flashback chronicling Davros's youth on Skaro, his experiment on Khalid's soldiers, and the explosion which disfigured him. This would all ultimately never be used, as it was too expensive. The Next Doctor. Despite settling on Victorian England, RTD was still having doubts about the setting, especially since 2005's The Unquiet Dead had already been set on a Victorian Christmas Eve. He contemplated shifting the adventure to the court of King Henry VIII, but rejected this notion on the grounds that it would not feature enough recognisable Yuletide traditions, most of which post-dated the 16th century. He also mused over another completely new idea, about a hotel which became displaced in time, entitled A Midwinter's Tale. It was eventually given to Phil Ford to develop for one of the other specials, but ultimately went unused. I wonder if Stephen Moffat resurrected this idea for Joy to the World, but that's only speculation. Planet of the Dead. On January 8th, the production team were informed that there had been an accident at the docks in the UAE port town of Jebel Ali 3 days prior. An 18-ton cargo container had been dropped on the roof of the double-decker bus, which had just arrived. It was briefly suggested that the second bus, kept behind in Cardiff, might be hastily transported to Dubai in time for filming. However, a bus would also be required for domestic recording both before and after the Dubai shoot, and there was no guarantee that a third bus could be located and purchased in time. The only feasible option was to amend the script so that the bus suffered structural damage while travelling through the wormhole. A design team was quickly flown to the UAE to ensure that the damaged bus could still be used safely during production there. A third bus would still have to be acquired, albeit with less urgency, so that it could be similarly damaged and used for filming in Cardiff alongside its undamaged counterpart. The Waters of Mars. For a long time, this special was intended to air on November the 23rd, as the production team had anticipated. However, a late decision was made to bring the special forward to a Sunday on November the 15th and avoid a collision with ITV's reality powerhouse, The X Factor. Meanwhile, former Doctor Who producer, executive producer, director and writer Barry Letts passed away on October the 9th. In recognition of Barry Letts' enormous influence on Doctor Who and on British TV in general, The Waters of Mars was dedicated to his memory. The End of Time. The expansion of David Tennant's finale to 2 episodes meant that RTD had to abandon an idea he had already been considering. It would have seen the TARDIS materialise on board a spacecraft carrying an alien family. The Doctor would sacrifice his life to prevent a radiation leak and save these ordinary, seemingly unimportant beings. Although RTD liked the notion of the 10th Doctor's regeneration taking place in such unremarkable circumstances, as opposed to blockbuster events that had characterised each of his season finales, he was concerned that viewers would be deflated by the anticlimax. With twice the amount of screen time now available, however, there was no debate. Such a simple idea could not be stretched to 2 hours of television. And that's it. Thanks very much for watching. Let me know what your favourite trivia and facts are from this era, and I'll see you next time where we'll be looking at the 11th Doctor. Goodbye everyone.